Hi, you guys. Welcome back to History 1302. Today's lecture is going to be on America's quest for an empire, and then we're going to go ahead and get started with World War One pretty soon after that. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over our objectives for this lesson. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to be explaining the major reasons for the growing call in the late 1800s for the United States to develop an overseas empire. So we're going to talk about, what were some of the attitudes that people used to justify, expanding the U.S. border. So we'll get to that in a second. Then we're going to describe America's first moves towards an empire. So, specific acquisitions, and things of that nature as well. Then we're going to explain the major reasons for the Spanish-American War of 1898, and then we'll describe the growth of imperialism in the United States during the Progressive Era. So that is what we're going to be discussing today. Before we get into World War I, this is all part of Chapter 20 in your book. So just go ahead and go back and read that chapter if you haven't already done so. And today we're going to talk about the major points, the big ideas that you should absolutely know before moving on to the test. Okay. All right, so first things first, let's talk about America's quest for an empire. You can tell I'm excited, right? Because we're getting closer and closer to World War I. But anyways, before we get into that, we need to talk about what's happening in the United States as it continues to grow and expand. But before we get into that, it's very important that you understand that up until all of these changes started happening in the United States, the U.S. government had a foreign policy of isolationism. Okay, they've been doing that since 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, now the 1823 Monroe Doctrine basically said that the U.S. would stay out of Europe and that Europe needed to stay out of the Americas. Okay, now this was an issue of self-preservation. Okay. For the United States, ever since after the War of 1812, when we went to war with Britain again, we barely made it out of that one. We barely won, right? And I guess some of the lessons that they learned about that was that the U.S. was not in any way ready to be engaging in wars with other countries or conflicts or, doing any of that stuff. And the other thing, too, is Europe was war after war after war, and the U.S. needed to stay out of it completely. So this was about self-preservation. This was basically the U.S. declaring that we are going to stay out of Europe, but that Europe also needed to stay out of, our realm, our side of the, Western Hemisphere. Why did this all happen? Well, Americans took this policy very, very seriously. This was the foreign policy up until, we go to World War I, so we're going to stay out of it completely, except we kind of don't. And so we're going to talk about, in which way specifically doesn't the U.S. stay isolated? The ironic thing about all of this is that the U.S. is isolated towards Europe, but not so much Latin America, not so much the Pacific. And so, we're going to talk about the reasons why. But by the time we get to World War I and, American involvement in World War I, which doesn't happen until 1917, this was it. Like, we were total isolationists, so it's going to take some pretty big and important reasons, to break away with that foreign policy. So again, everything is connected, everything is lining up. Before we get to World War I, we need to talk about what's happening in the United States. We need to talk about what changes the country's undergoing, and more importantly, the reasons why. Okay, so why the quest for an empire? Well, number one, there was economic and political competition that the U.S., wanted to be a part of. This was about, the growth of the nation. Now, remember, as the U.S. industrialized. We are producing more products than we can actually consume. This is all part and parcel with all of the like the booms and busts that were part of the previous unit. And so the idea here is, the United States wants to tap in to new markets, right? We need to expand our markets. We need to have foreign trade, and we need to be able to make colonies and to establish those colonies so that the United States can essentially expand into those regions. Okay, so we can sell our stuff to them. And so remember, it's not just the United States that's industrializing, it's like pretty much every big nation in the world as well. And so there's a lot of competition here between the United States and Britain, between, and France and the rest of Europe. The other thing as well is that by the 1890s, China is starting to, let foreigners in and are showing interest, showing signs that they would like to trade with other countries. And the United States wants a part of that. They want a piece of that action too. Because in many ways, you guys, having access to these foreign markets and being able to expand our borders would mean that we can, increase our customer base. Now, why is this necessary? Well, because even though the United States has expanded its industry, has expanded its economy, the consumer mentality, like the consumer culture, is not really there like it is today. I mean, people at this time are still, they have like one pair of shoes that, will carry them until literally like the soles are falling off. And then what do people do? They fix them, right? It's not at all like today where, like, if you look in your closet, how many pairs of jeans do you have? How many sneakers do you have? Ladies, how many shoes do you have, right? I mean, I have like black shoes for every occasion. Some boots that are like wedges, and some are heels, and some are pointy toes, and some are, like knee high, below the knee, thigh high. It's just incredible, right? And we consume, these products at a very fast pace. That's not that is not what is happening, during this time period. So having access to more customers, having access, establishing colonies around the world would solve our overproduction problem, which is why we were going through all these booms and busts and things like that. Okay, so the key here is to have access to those markets, to tap into the Chinese market, and they call this the open door policy, right? The U.S. wants China, want to trade with China, and with as China is starting to show that they have interest in doing so. Now, why does China have interest in doing that? Well, China is a huge country with a lot of people, and at the time, they're not very industrialized. So they need to import these things, from other countries, which is like totally the opposite of today, right? Today's like the reverse. We import everything from China. I dare you to go through your purse, go through your bag, go through your room and look at stuff and, where was it made? Almost everything is made in China. Right? So, again, very different situation than it is today. But the U.S. does not want to miss out on that because everybody, China's starting to open up its borders. China's starting to show interest that they want to let foreigners in. And the U.S. wants a piece of that action. We don't want to get left behind. Okay, so this is reason number one why Americans are going to support, building an empire. All right, so that's reason number one. There's going to be three that we're going to talk about. That's one. Let's talk about number two. Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. Now, a thesis is an argument, right? Frederick Jackson Turner is a historian, all right? And Manifest Destiny is something that you're probably familiar with, right, from 1301. It's essentially this idea, this belief that, God had chosen the United States, the American people, to encompass this area from, this whole continent, right, from sea to shining sea, and that it was like God's plan, and Americans were all for it, okay? So by the time we get to this time period, that sentiment is not dead. even after they reached the Pacific, even after, we completed our destiny, right? Even after we went to war with Mexico and got Texas and all of the American Southwest, we did it, right? We've manifested our destiny and we've accomplished everything that we set out to do. And this manifest destiny stuff is powerful juju, okay? Now, that's the backstory to this. By 1890, okay, Frederick Jackson Turner is going to give, by 1890, there's this new census, okay? You know how they do it every 10 years. And in 1890, what was it? Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank completely here. But do you remember when we talked about the Chicago World's Fair, and I showed you that picture with Nikola Tesla and Edison like fighting for who's going to light the Chicago World's Fair for the first time? Well, he's at that Chicago World's Fair and he's presenting a paper, right? He's making a speech here where he's essentially arguing that based on the 1890 census, essentially that the frontier had closed. There were Americans living on every inch of the United States. And because of that, and by the way, when he's talking about this, like, we've accomplished this, we've manifested our destiny, people are like, yeah, hurrah, like America, right? Waving flags and stuff like that. That's how powerful of an idea it was. But the problem is, because he's like, yeah, that's great, but hold on, let me get to my point. Turner is essentially going to argue that based on the fact that the American frontier has officially closed, right? He's going to make the argument that, having the frontier there is what has inspired Americans to continue pushing forward, to be unafraid of the unknown, to essentially innovate and explore and dominate. And, he's like tapping into these ideas of American exceptionalism. Because he's saying having a frontier there has been what has driven Americans to be as great, of a nation as we are. And like I said, he's talking about this stuff and Americans are like, yeah, love it. They love it. But here's like the the switch. What he's going to argue is that what's going to happen now that the American frontier is closed, right? So in other words, if this is what has made our nation great, right? If there isn't a frontier there, and everything that is good about us is because of the frontier, what is going to happen next? The implication here is, who do we become if we don't have a frontier? Does this mean that the United States is going to start to decline? Like, have we reached our peak? And are we doomed? And, for some people, they're like, yeah, and then they're like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. And so he's trying to come up with, a solution to this problem. Because if the frontier is what has made it special, what has driven the United States to be as great of a country and the American people along with that, then how do we continue that trend? How do we continue that success? Well, for some people, the answer to that question is, quite simply, make a new frontier. Continue to expand. And like I said, it's powerful, powerful stuff, right? I mean, we already have a great excuse here with, competition with Europe, wanting access to China. We don't want to get left behind. We're industrializing at a fast pace. We're being able to compete, finally, with these European countries, especially in light of what happened after the War of 1812, where we kind of realized, like, hey, we're not ready for that. We don't even have roads and a proper military. And so the U.S. had essentially decided to focus on itself and develop its economy and develop its cities and develop its industry and develop its factories. And it did. And it did great. And so if we want to continue that trend, we have to establish markets outside of the United States. So that is a powerful reason why people are going to support, building an empire. And then you've got this manifest destiny, frontier thesis that scares the bejesus out of Americans, because they really think, like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? We are going to peak. We are going to, we've peaked. We're going to decline. And so the solution to that is simple. Build a new frontier. Okay, so we've got two very powerful reasons why Americans are going to support building an empire. But it doesn't end there, right? Because if that still doesn't convince you, there is another reason that I want to talk to you about. It's called Nativism, okay? Now, Nativism is a very specific form of racism, okay? It's essentially racism towards foreigners, right? Is that nativists are the best, like Americans, real Native Americans. And it's funny because we're not talking about, Indian Native Americans. They're talking about, like original settlers, Englishmen, like they're the real Native Americans. But we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so quite possibly the clearest explanation for this, white man's burden is what they call it, comes from Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling is an author. You might have heard of him, or you might like, what? I've never heard that name before, but I'm sure you've heard of some of his books. Most famously, The Jungle Book, was written by him. And then another one that I remember reading, like in elementary school, was Rikki Tikki Tavi, which was like the story about a mongoose and a snake. Anyway, so that's who Rudyard Kipling is, right? Now, what is this white man's burden? What does it mean? And how does it convince Americans that, we've got to build an empire? Well, white man's burden is simply this idea that Americans are so privileged that it is our responsibility to look out for the rest of the world, right? More specifically, our little brown brothers, and because they look at them as these half devil, half child who are threatening, but also need our guidance and they need our assistance. And so white man's burden is simple, okay? It's this idea that Americans are so gifted, so talented, so privileged that we have a responsibility to take democracy and Christianity to the non-white, non-Western parts of the world. Does that make sense? I mean, even if they don't ask us to, okay? So, this meant that even though they were, our little brown brothers are less than us, right? Or less than them, right? I always do this thing where I put myself in their shoes, or I try to kind of like get into their head. So I do that a lot. You'll hear me say like, oh, like us, we're doing this, because I'm in that mode. And it's kind of hard for me to imagine that, right? To think that we are so talented, we are so gifted, we are so privileged that even though these little brown brothers don't have it all, they are threatening, but we also have a responsibility, which is where the burden comes from, to educate them, to instruct them, to teach them in the ways of, America. And, again, powerful stuff because they believe it. They're essentially using race to justify that the U.S. is fit to conquer other nations. Again, this is white man's burden. It's a responsibility that Americans feel, they have. It's a burden. It's like an albatross, right? That you have to carry with you. It's like a cross. It's a burden. You got to carry this burden with you, and you have a responsibility to make it right, to instruct them, to teach them, even if they don't ask us to, right? Because they don't know any better, essentially, is what the argument is. So super powerful stuff. And I mean, even today, there's still attitudes, in the United States, people that believe that everybody in the world wants to be like us, that, countries in the Middle East want to be democratic, or, in other, more obscure parts of the, corners of the world, that people there want to be like us. That sentiment hasn't quite gone away either, but that's essentially where it's coming from, okay? So again, 3 super powerful reasons for the justification of building an empire. I don't care which one, you think is the most powerful one. There's something in here for everybody. Okay, now not everybody's going to agree, and you'll see that in your book, and we'll talk about that later on. Especially, you remember Samuel Gompers from the American Federation of Labor, right? The Jewish cigar maker. He's going to be super opposed to all of this, but not for the reasons that you think. He's no humanitarian, right? But he believes that building these colonies or whatever is actually going to be hurtful to the American worker, because it's going to drop wages, it's going to outsource, American jobs, and for Filipinos or for other groups. And he's going to be very, very resistant. He's going to be one of the loud opposition voices to all of this. But don't forget the 3 reasons. Super powerful stuff. Again, we're not turning our back 100% on isolationism, but we're getting there, right? We're breaking these things little by little. But again, our isolationism is focused towards Europe, but not, Latin America or Central America or the Caribbean or the Pacific or China or any of these other things. So, yeah, all right. Powerful, powerful stuff. Let's go to the next part here. So if we were to summarize everything that we just said, what are like the pros and the cons of all of this? What are Americans afraid of? Americans are afraid of that we continue being isolated, that we're going to miss out on all the land grabbing that's going on, that there is going to be a complete loss for the United States in achieving, access to these other world markets. And what that means is a loss of geopolitical power as well. So the U.S. is not going to be, these people are afraid that the U.S. is not going to be on the same level or footing as these other, big powerful nations. Now, is the United States the most powerful country in the world at this point? No. But it will happen after World War I, okay? And in part because, these other countries are going to be destroyed by the war. But we'll get to that soon enough. Now, what are the benefits to all of this, right? So what do Americans have to look forward to? Well, there are substantial profits to be made here. There is so much money that can be made. All we got to do is we got to be there, okay? And there's also, if we're able to colonize other places, or if we're able to acquire them, then, we can increase not just our presence and our economy, right? Our, economic power, but also build a network of military bases. And so then we're also going to increase our military presence, our military power, which goes in line with, wanting to compete with these European countries for, we want to seat at the big boys table is essentially, what Americans are getting ready to do here. So, you look at it from that perspective, people look at it as a win-win. Okay, there's much too much to lose here if we do nothing, if we remain isolated. But if we don't, and we continue with this quest to acquire an empire, then there's incredible money to be made, substantial profits, but then also we increase our political power and our military power, okay? All right, so let's talk about some of these acquisitions, right? How does the United States go about acquiring this empire? And so for that part, I want to talk about American Samoa, Hawaii, and Alaska, okay? Well, look at this map right here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. All right, so Hawaii, where is Hawaii? The Hawaiian Islands, the U.S. is going to acquire that in 1898. Look at this over here, though, because if you look at the legend, it says, anything green was acquired by purchase, and anything orange was either through war, occupation, or unilateral decision. And that's the case in Hawaii. Okay, so Hawaii, prior to 1898, Hawaii had a queen. And you can read all about this in your book, Queen Liliuokalani. Okay, so Hawaii is totally independent. They have a queen, But things get a little bit tricky because there are American businesses in Hawaii that would love to be able to call Hawaii a part of the United States, because then they wouldn't have to pay any kind of taxes to import, things like pineapples and stuff like that. And so a decision is made there that, among businesses, American businesses, that it would be in the best interest not just of their companies but also Hawaii to become a part of the United States. So the Navy doesn't go in there, the U.S. military doesn't go in there, but essentially these American businessmen depose the Queen. It's like a coup. Now, even though the military doesn't actually, get involved in there, in that these businessmen, in particular, the Dole Pineapple Company is involved in this as well. They have the support of the U.S. government. Okay, so essentially they go in there, they depose her, they remove her, and this is one of the. That's why it's called a unilateral decision. They make her an offer she can't refuse, and in 1898, Hawaii becomes a part of the United States. But if you look at this map, right? Look, Alaska is really, and the Aleutian Islands, right? It's really the only acquisition that was done through purchase. And so who does the United States buy Alaska from? Right? I mean, in your book they call it Seward's Folly. Like, they thought this was a huge mistake. Alaska was, a barren land. It was cold. There was nothing there. But then, of course, they ended up finding, like oil and gold and stuff like that. But who did they buy it from? The answer to that question is Russia, right? They buy it from Russia, and the United States claims it, right? It's an acquisition there by purchase, but it's the only one. Because you also have here the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Midway, Johnson Island, Hawaii, Baker, all of these little American Samoa, Jarvis, Palmyra, and then over here Puerto Rico as well. All of those are orange, which means that they were all acquired through war, occupation, or unilateral decision. And so we're going to talk about Puerto Rico right now when we get to the Spanish-American War. But look at, why does the U.S. want to be here, right? Why in the Philippines? Why in Guam? Why? What's really close by that the United States wants access to? China. So again, this is about establishing colonies to have access to more customers, but also to get closer and closer to China. We want that open door policy. We want to be able to tap into that market. We want to trade with them. And so this is part of the reason why in the Philippines especially, after the Spanish-American War is over, the Filipinos are like, okay, great, thanks America, thanks for helping us get our independence. And the Americans are like, yeah, we ain't going anywhere because you're right next to China. And so, the Filipinos are going to have to fight the United States. They think, wait a minute, like we want our independence. Like, what are you doing? And so it's going to get really ugly, but we'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So again, these are the moves that the United States is making to acquire this empire. Some are through purchase, which people were super critical of because they thought it was a huge mistake, but all the other ones here are through essentially war and occupation, okay? So let's talk about one of the key elements to all of this. There's this hugely influential book, very powerful book, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And it is written by a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan. Okay, now, this guy wrote a book. It's essentially a book about the history of Great Britain. Okay, it's called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1660 to 1783. Now, in this book, he's essentially charting the success of Great Britain, how, it became a very, very powerful nation. Even though it's a small island country, it's got this huge overseas empire. Now, in it, Mahan talks about how part of the key to the success of Britain was that they have this big, powerful, huge navy. That is how they're able to, lay claim to such a huge overseas empire, but also be able to protect its own industry in its own country. So, in it, I want to show you a part of this, part of his book. Mahan is describing here one of the interesting things here. He says the interesting and significant feature of this changing attitude is the turning of the eyes outward instead of inward only. So remember, he's talking about isolationism and stuff like that. So to affirm the importance of distant markets and to the relation of them to our own immense powers of production, it implies logically the recognition of the link that joins the products and the markets, that is, the carrying trade, the three together constituting the chain of maritime powers to which Great Britain owes her wealth and greatness. Further, is it too much to say that as two of these links, the shipping and the markets are exterior to our own borders. The acknowledgement of them carries with it a view of the relations of the United States to the world radically distinct from the simple idea of self-sufficingness. Okay. We shall not follow far this line of thought before there will dawn the realization of America's unique position facing the older worlds of the East and the West, her shores washed by the oceans which touch the one or the other, but which are common to her alone. What is Alfred Thayer Mahan saying here? Okay, he has written this whole book depicting and charting the success of Great Britain as a nation, this tiny little island nation, and how did it manage to, become this powerful? Because at the time, Great Britain is the most powerful country in the world. But then he starts talking about the United States, and then he starts making these connections, right? It's like maybe we should stop looking inward and start looking outward, because the United States is in this very unique position, right? The country itself, geographically speaking, touches both the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast and the Pacific Ocean on the west coast. And no other country in the world has that same position. Access to the old world, access to the new world, poised with industry and people and workers and factories. I mean, what he's essentially arguing here is that the United States is in the perfect position to become the most powerful nation in the world. The only thing that it's missing is what? What does he give credit to Great Britain's success? The Navy. And I know it sounds crazy, like, wait a minute, like, this is just a book. I cannot emphasize enough how important books are to history. I mean, at this time, like, books are everything. I mean, they still continue to be, but to a lesser extent, the way that we, consume information and stuff like that, that's evolving. But at this time, literally, like, everybody's reading this book. It is such a powerful thing because everybody, all of these different governments, all of these different countries are looking at Alfred Thayer Mahan's book and going, he's absolutely right. And not so much the part about the United States, but they're going at it like, whoa, the key to success here, we want to be the most powerful nation in the world like Great Britain did, is the Navy. Okay? And so the United States looks at this and they are just stunned. They are super motivated. They're like, we got to build up this Navy. Okay? And in the years after this book is published, Congress is going to authorize the construction of an all-steel, steam-driven battleships with these long-range artillery, guns. Remember, we're in the middle of industrialization. It's happening. It's happening. And to show you just how quickly this change, unfolds, from 1889 to 1893, the U.S. Navy goes from 17th in the world to number 7. Okay? And the funny thing about that, not funny, haha, but funny because, we're going to go to war soon, is that it's not just the United States that's building up its navy. It's literally like every other powerful nation in the world, especially Germany. But we'll get to that soon enough. Germany, Britain, France, the US, they're all building up this navy because they all want to be big, powerful nations. The problem with that is that it doesn't lead to peace. Right? It leads to war. All right, so please don't forget who Alfred Thayer Mahan is. He is super important to all of this. I know it sounds silly, like, oh, it's just a book. No, it's more than just a book. It's ideas. It's power, shared knowledge, and more importantly, it's what these nations do with that information. Okay, so you got to know about this guy. Okay, you got to know about this book. It's a huge influence, to all of the changes that are happening, prior to World War I. Okay, so let's talk about the Spanish-American War. All right, so the Spanish-American War, it's an interesting thing because it's very short-lived. It doesn't last very long, which gives these countries a false sense that, when the next Great War breaks out, they think literally it's going to end like in 6 months, like the Spanish-American War did. Or, in the case of Prussia and France, no, not so much. But what's happening here is, the Spanish-American War is the clearest form where, obviously, the Spanish are trying to hold on to their position. Remember that in 1301 we talked about, colonialism and, where the Spanish settled and where the English went and where the French went. And, think about the conquistadores and think about how they conquered, Latin America, Central America, South America. They conquered the Incas. They conquered the Aztecs. And all of that gold and all of that, land claim essentially made the Spanish a very, very powerful, the most powerful nation in the world. Excuse my squeaky chair. Oh. Anyway, so that was that. Over time, Spanish influence and power had been in a decline. Okay, and so just to kind of put things into perspective, the same year that the Spanish-American War breaks out, it's the same year that the U.S. acquires Hawaii. Okay, so this is putting the United States in in that area, close to the Philippines. So this, which belonged to Spain at the time. Okay, so Spanish-American War is going to last a very, very short time. But in the beginning, it is being fought for humanitarian reasons, right? Look at this image right here. This is one of these like prisoner of wars that, the Spanish were capturing, because essentially what's happening is Filipinos, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and all of these other islands are rebelling against Spanish control. They look at the Spanish king or the Spanish monarchy and they go, you know what? Like, we don't associate with you. We don't identify with you. We don't see ourselves as Spanish. We are proud Cubans, or we're proud Puerto Ricans, or we're proud Filipinos. And we are tired of being controlled by you. We don't want you here. We want you out. We want our independence. Now, remember also that after the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence is going to be inspiration for all of these other, revolutionary movements and movements for independence. But when we talk about the Spanish-American War, the United States initially gets involved for humanitarian reasons, okay? They hear all of these, like, horrible stories coming out of Cuba, coming out of the Philippines, coming out of Puerto Rico, of what the Spanish government is doing to these people that are simply fighting for their independence. And again, when the United States hears about things like this, it's like, ooh, it goes to the core, right? It goes to our heart, because that is our story. Later on in the semester, when we talk about Vietnam, that is going to come back again. It's like, wait a minute, but they want independence from France, but we're sort of split as well because France is like our only ally. Not our only, but anyway, so more on that to come, right? Powerful stuff. The U.S. wants to get involved for humanitarian reasons. They hear all of these horror stories coming out of it. And again, it goes hand in hand with the fact that Spanish influence and power is in a decline. All of these people want independence. And so it really resonates with people in the United States. Now, one of the reasons why this sentiment is felt across people all over the United States has a lot to do with yellow journalism. Now, yellow journalism is like, well, we might know it today as like fake news, right? God, I hate that phrase. Alternative facts. Oh, no. But basically what's happening here is you have newspapers competing with each other. More specifically, you have like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who are competing with one another, in the newspaper market. And what they are doing is they are publishing these stories about what is happening, the atrocities that the Spanish are doing, but they are exaggerating them. That is what yellow journalism is. It's highly exaggerated news stories, and they are doing this to get more readers, because it's scandalous and because it offends Victorian era Americans, and their moral sensibilities. And so they're writing these stories left and right, and it gets more readers. They're competing with one another. They also have a vested interest in seeing that the United States gets involved in this, but mostly they do it for money. Okay, they're doing it to sell more papers and that stuff. Hearst is going to send reporters to Cuba to report on all the horrible things that the Spanish are doing, and the stories just get more and more crazy and just out of control. And then he publishes a story about how the Spanish officials are raping nuns. And, it creates this huge outcry. And so, again, this is putting a lot of pressure on President William McKinley to do something. Now, McKinley doesn't want to get involved, right? Because remember, we're supposed to be isolationists, but there's a growing voice among the American public, that we got to do something. And this yellow journalism isn't helping at all. The other sort of facet to this very complicated situation is that there are American businesses in places like Cuba, for example, which is controlled by the Spanish, which they're trying to how do you put it, like put out that rebellion, that revolt. And so there are American businesses, business interests in Cuba, in these places that are controlled by the Spanish. And so this is another reason why the United States is looking at a possible reason for involvement. Okay, now remember, it started out for humanitarian reasons, but then we've got American business interests that we need to protect. We have the fact that all of these horrible stories are coming out of there. We got yellow journalism, which is getting more and more support from the American people, putting pressure on McKinley to act, to do something. And then, of course, the fact that Spain is in a decline. And, this is like a great opportunity if, Spain were to lose control of these colonies. Well, maybe the United States could swoop in and, take some of them. Maybe. So think about all of that, okay? Because all of this stuff is happening in the background. And then two things happen. Okay, the first is a letter is intercepted. A letter that was written by Spain's U.S. ambassador, William Dupuy de Lome. And in this letter, de Lome is very critical, to put it nicely, of McKinley. Okay, so he basically, he's writing to, it's a personal friend, and he's writing to him where he criticizes the U.S. President McKinley talks about how, you know, he's weak, how the United States wouldn't think of getting involved in this because, you know, they are going to get obliterated. The Spanish are just going to take them out. It's going to be like a, you know, devastating loss for the Americans. And then Dupuy basically alludes to the fact, or not the fact, but to his opinion, that because the U.S. President McKinley is weak, in his opinion, you know, basically says stuff like, you know, McKinley doesn't have the you-know-what to declare war. And this letter is made public. Okay, so this is Spain's U.S. ambassador, okay? Guy from Spain, ambassador to the U.S., writes his letter about the president, and it gets published. Again, you know, yellow journalism, right? Sensationalist news coverage, which we're all familiar with, right? We're like living in it. And it is the most embarrassing thing to you know, up until this point, because gosh, you know, the bar keeps getting lower and lower, but up until this point, it is the most humiliating thing ever done to a U.S. president. And it gets Americans pissed. They want some kind of retribution. You know, they're getting closer and closer to wanting to go to war. Okay, remember, we're isolationists. We're not there yet, but this is hitting all of those boxes, okay? Now, we're not at war yet, okay? But there's a lot of pressure going on here. McKinley doesn't want to go to war. You know, he's like consulting with Teddy Roosevelt at the time, who was like Secretary of the Navy. And, you know, he's trying to find a way to avoid going to war, but also saving face and not looking weak. And so, you know, Roosevelt basically advises him, like, hey, send some ships, you know, to Cuba, send some ships to, you know, the area around the Philippines, just in case something happens, okay? We want to be prepared, and you want to send a strong message, that sort of thing. And what happens next is a complete accident. It shouldn't have happened, but when the USS Maine blows up, okay, this is an American ship that had been sent to Havana, right? To the harbor in Havana, basically just to, you know, to be there in case that there is some kind of a conflict and Americans need to be pulled out of there. You know, they're just there to like survey the area, make sure that nothing is happening. But when the ship arrives in Havana, these U.S. soldiers were basically given instructions not to, you know, disembark the ship. They're just to stay on the ship and just supervise, observe the situation in case of any hostilities breaking out. And then one night, and it was kind of funny because, you know, the Americans on the ship, you know, with binoculars, like looking at, you know, the people on the island, and the people on the island are like looking at them. I mean, tension is, you could cut it with a knife. And then one night, the ship blows up. And I mean, like I said, it was a complete accident. But at the time when this happens, remember, there's tension. Americans are like ready to go. They've insulted the president, you know. At the time when this ship blows up, the immediate perception here, like the way that people, what they thought had happened, was that the Spanish had blown it up, that the Spanish had attacked a U.S. ship, and, you know, they're ready to go to war. But that's not what happened, okay? And we didn't find out about the true, you know, circumstances of, you know, the USS Maine blowing up until literally like 100 years later. You know, it blew up. It was a total accident, something to do with like a boiler. And it's not a funny thing because, you know, 266 soldiers lost their lives. And I think close to 100 of them were entombed with the ship underwater for, you know, close to 100 years. So, what happened? Well, remember, at the time, they don't know that it was an accident. They don't know that it was, that the Spanish had nothing to do with it. But that is exactly what the American people think happened. And they perceived that the Spanish had taken these deliberate, steps to go into war. They saw this as an act of war, even though they couldn't prove it. That's how it looked to them. And so, even though we have all of these other reasons why tensions are high between the United States and between Cubans and the Spanish, ultimately, the blowing up of the U.S.'s Maine is what compels the U.S. to declare war on Spain. But, what's going to happen once Cuba, for example, gets its independence? Well, the Teller Amendment in here is basically Congress stating that once these people become independent, that the U.S. doesn't want to have claim to Cuba. Okay, it's essentially legally preventing the U.S. from annexing or acquiring Cuba. Okay, so we declare war, but we also declare that we're not going to be claiming Cuba. We're going to help them get their independence, but we don't want it. And there's all kinds of racist reasons for that too. But when isn't it about race? All right. So let's talk about why this war is so short. Why it doesn't last that long. Teddy Roosevelt. Let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt. I love it. Wait, hold on. We'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt right now. Okay, so remember my map, right? Spanish acquisitions include the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Okay, sorry, I'm looking at my map over here because I can't see. So, but you can see. I'm sorry. It's because I have two screens because I'm losing my sight. And so the United States, remember, they're already positioned over here near the Philippines in case something happened, right? Which coincidentally, it did when the U.S.'s Maine blew up. So they're already in position to go. And they're over here because this is where most of the fighting is, where everything is happening is Cuba and Puerto Rico. Now, what this means for the United States is they're going to have to fight on two fronts. And you never want to do that, okay? This is like the worst possible strategy because, it splits up your manpower, your resources, your ships, your soldiers. It increases your chance of failure. It takes twice as long, or it could, because of those reasons that I just mentioned. And, it takes longer to win. So ideally, you want to fight, one front first and then the other, right? You want to concentrate all resources and effort in one area and then go to the other one. You never want to fight on two fronts. And for the United States, that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to be fighting in the Philippines, against the Spanish, and over here in Cuba and Puerto Rico against the Spanish. So just going off of the book, right? The playbook of, war. You never want to fight on two fronts because it increases your chances of failure. It takes longer. You're splitting up your resources, all of that. But despite those things that I just mentioned, the U.S. actually does fairly well. And so I'm going to talk about the Rough Riders, okay? Here is a picture of them, and that right there is Teddy Roosevelt, okay? So what happens here with the Rough Riders, first of all, who are they, right? Remember I told you Teddy Roosevelt, he's not president, he's not vice president, he works for the Navy, Secretary of the Navy, okay? So when war breaks out, Teddy Roosevelt literally, quits his job and, puts together this very eclectic group of American businessmen and Ivy Leaguers. You got, bankers and stockbrokers, Native Americans as well. I mean, and calls them, the Rough Riders, okay? Now, what do these guys all have in common? Well, they come from, different backgrounds, different economic backgrounds and things like that. But the one thing that they have in common is that they are super patriotic, right? They believe in this cause. They want to go fight. And this is what nationalism is. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt is a perfect example of like jingoism. He's like a jingo. Um, because they believe that the US is the best and they want to prove it. Okay? Which is one of the things that we're going to see also with the outbreak of World War I is that they're excited to go to war. They want to go. I mean, literally, these guys quit their jobs. You want to go fight. And they think it's going to be glorious, and it is. They call it a splendid little war, the Spanish-American War. That charge up San Juan Hill for the Rough Riders is really going to cement Teddy Roosevelt's reputation. It's also going to basically catapult him, to the vice presidency. McKinley is going to choose him as his running mate, gets reelected, and then McKinley dies shortly thereafter. And this makes Teddy Roosevelt president of the United States. I think he was the youngest at the time. Anyways, he was fairly young at the time. But anyways, we'll talk more about Teddy Roosevelt later. But that's what happens here. Now, like I said, the fighting is not just in the Caribbean, like in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but also in the Philippines, in Guam and the Philippines. And so by that time, the United States is perfectly positioned to essentially scoop up, some of those colonies that are going to be left available by the defeat of the Spanish. And again, this goes to the heart of the issue, right? The United States would be perfectly positioned to be able to trade with China, should we be able to go into, that area. So let's talk about the Philippines, okay? Because remember, we're fighting in two fronts at the same time. In the case of the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, he is somebody that has been fighting the Spanish already for the Philippines. He assumes when the U.S. arrives to help that, they're there to assist in overthrowing the Spanish, and that they would leave immediately after. But the U.S. had no intention of leaving, okay? So this is going to create a problem once the war is over, because then Aguinaldo is going to declare war in the United States in 1899, okay? And, at first the U.S. sends 20,000 military troops to the Philippines. They thought that they were inferior, okay, and brutally suppress the Filipinos. The war doesn't end between the United States and the Philippines. This is after they kick out the Spanish. But the war doesn't end between the United States and the Philippines until 1902. That's 3 years. Okay? The U.S. public are basically told that, we're going to be done soon, but that didn't happen. The Philippines are going to get their independence until after World War II. Okay, independence from the United States, and that's until 1946. Okay, so it does have a huge influence on what American policy is going to be in Cuba, the way that all of this sort of develops over time. Okay, the fighting, by the way, between the United States and the Filipinos is ugly. They're doing torture to each other, like waterboarding type stuff. Okay, brutal fighting. And again, like I said, they welcome the United States to come in and help them, kick out the Spanish. But then the Americans are like, no, not so fast. We ain't going anywhere. We're here to stay. And then the Filipinos turn around and they try to kick out the United States, but ultimately it fails. And the Philippines doesn't get their independence until after World War II. Okay, so again, why? Because they are perfectly positioned within China's reach, okay? And they can trade with them, and they can have that open door policy and all of those things that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, okay? All right, so long story short, the Americans win. Spain is kicked out. They grant Cuba independence, and the Spanish are going to essentially give up possession of these other colonies to the United States. So let's talk about those colonies that the Spanish hand over to the U.S. We're talking about Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Okay, when it comes to Cuba, okay, Cuba is going to be independent. And I say independent because, well, they're not. Congress, U.S. Congress is going to pass the Platt Amendment, I have that right here, in 1901, which is basically a policy statement about Cuba, okay, which says that Cuba, although independent, Cuba is not allowed to negotiate any kind of treaties with any other nation without U.S. supervision or approval, okay? Think about that. Cuba, although independent, cannot negotiate any treaties with any other nation without U.S. supervision or approval. Now, this totally negates, okay, contradicts independence, does it not? I mean, and the agreement is mandatory here, okay? They are putting in these, sanitary regulations for the Cubans. And it also allows for the lease of a military base on the island, in Cuba for the United States for forever. Okay? Forever. And what military base am I talking about? What is it called? Right? It's one of the most notorious, infamous, bases belonging to the United States. It's in Cuba. It's Guantanamo Bay. Okay? In case you ever wondered, how did the U.S. come to acquire Guantanamo Bay? It's essentially like a thank you for helping the Cubans get their independence from Spain. Would you call this independence? No. But what does the American government use to justify this Platt Amendment? Well, remember, they are our little brown brothers, and also we have American business interests in Cuba that we need to protect. Because if we look at our map, right, Cuba is what, like 90 miles away from the United States, right? So part of the reason why they don't want it, remember the Teller Amendment, right, is because Cuba is a biracial country, right? And making it a part of the United States is really not in line with some of their, desires to preserve their demographics. Okay, there, I said it the most political way that I can. But also, we have American businesses located there that the U.S. needs to protect. And so the Teller Amendment is going to do that, right? And so when they pass the Platt Amendment, right, it's basically saying, okay, Cuba is independent, but they cannot go into any treaties with any nations without supervision and American approval. Because they're basically saying that the Cubans don't have what it takes to be able to govern themselves. And the U.S. is really afraid that they would make a decision that would ultimately hurt American interests. Okay? And then, of course, you have the base, Guantanamo Bay, which they've been trying to close, for a while now, but I don't know if that's ever going to happen. Anyways, okay, so that's what happens with Cuba. Let's talk about what happens with Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, okay? Remember, those are going to be acquisitions from that basically Spain gives to the U.S. once they get defeated. But the question is, well, what happens to the people in Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico? Are they U.S. citizens? Well, what do you think? The answer to this basically comes in the form of several, a series of Supreme Court cases known as the insular cases, which essentially declare that, Guamanians, Puerto Ricans were not citizens, okay? Filipinos are included in that. They're basically saying that they are colonies of the United States, but they are not citizens. Now, over time, more cases will come, and those people in those colonies will get citizenship status. And in fact, I would challenge you right now and ask you, what do you think? Do you think that Puerto Rico What's its status of Puerto Ricans today? People get confused with this one. Are they United States citizens or not? What say you? Yes or no? The answer to this question is that they are U.S. citizens, which is hilarious every time I see some, troll on YouTube, telling Puerto Ricans to go back to their country. It's like, oh, they are. But anyways, they're giving them flack, because they're wearing shirts with, the Puerto Rican flag. Oh, like, Super Bowl, right? Recently, when, what's her name? J-Lo was with the Puerto Rican flag, and people are like, oh my God, losing their minds. It's like, they're U.S. citizens. Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. But, you wouldn't say anything to somebody if they were wearing, a t-shirt with a Texas, the Texas flag. I mean, we're like proud Texans, right? How is this any different? But anyways, I digress. So Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, and they've been fighting for statehood. So they are not a state yet. We will see what happens. I don't know. I even saw a petition not long ago. Oh my gosh, I don't know what it's called, the website. But it's like the one where you are like, you sign. Oh gosh, I forget what it's called. But anyways, where they're proposing that North and South Dakota become Super Dakota or Mega Dakota, something like that, to make room for Puerto Rico, because one of the arguments that people have used before against Puerto Rican statehood is that that would make it 51 states, and where would you put like the 51st flag? I mean the star on the flag, like it would look weird. And so anyways, Mega Dakota. Anyway, so that's the deal right there. Are we settled? We have just a little bit more to talk about, and then we're going to be done with American imperialism. I want to talk about these progressive presidents and their progressive, foreign policies during this time as well. So like I told you, Teddy Roosevelt, he becomes president when Willie McKinley is shot. Because he was his VP, right? He becomes his VP after, all of the fame and notoriety that came after the Spanish-American War. Becomes president in 1901. Where's my little cursor? And will be in office until 1908. So he does serve 2 terms. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's, his foreign policy approach is sort of nicknamed as the big stick policy. Okay, now let me give you a little backstory to Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt really envisioned the United States as making a big leap in the world. Okay, early in his career, he had a lot of health issues, and made people had made comments about his sexuality, and they've. So this guy, he's somebody that he was relatively sickly child. He had all kinds of like health issues and things like that. But then when he got to college, I believe he went to Harvard. He basically like reinvents himself. His image is this, He-Man, like super ultra mega macho. And there's a lot of like phallic imagery in his discourses, and like the image that he tries to portray. And if you don't know what a phallus is, look it up, okay? There's a lot of like hyper masculinity here in the imagery of what he says. I mean, the fact that it's a big stick policy should give you a clue as to what a phallus is, okay? He sees that, this is the same for other nations as well. When he's talking about this big stick policy, a real nation, in his opinion, is one that goes out and makes things happen. Okay, so take that into consideration when thinking about who Teddy Roosevelt is moving forward. Okay, so with Teddy Roosevelt, remember, we're isolationists, right? That is our foreign policy. But he's going to take this approach that is like a very militaristic version of the empire, right? Which is what the big stick is all about. Now, because we're isolationists, we're not going to be involved with European countries, right? And this is where the Roosevelt Corollary comes in. Make sure you write this down somewhere and that you understand what it is. This is like an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like an amendment to U.S. isolationism. What Roosevelt is saying here is that it was the right of the United States military, to militarily intervene in the nations of Latin America, right? Not if they asked us to. It doesn't matter. It was the right of the United States to intervene militarily, okay? What he's essentially doing here is he's trying to keep the European countries from meddling in Latin America, because he's saying that this is like our realm, okay? This is our side of the world. You need to stay out of it. And if A, European country has a problem with B, a Latin American country, then the U.S. will intervene on their behalf. Okay? Now, this is to keep them out, but also to exercise that, power over the Western Hemisphere. What the U.S. is essentially doing here under the Roosevelt Corollary is enacting international police powers. Okay? It has little to do with the relations between the Western Hemisphere and Europe, but it served as justification for the U.S. to intervene in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, and I could go on and on and on and on and on. Okay? And this is part of the reason why the U.S. has such a bad reputation among Latin American countries. Okay? It's because, you've heard this, I'm sure you've heard this before. It's like, who does the U.S. think they are, sticking their nose in where it doesn't belong, and nobody asks them to come and intervene here. And that's exactly what happens in the case of Panama. Okay? Let's talk about the Panama Canal. Now, prior to 1904, Panama was not independent from Colombia. Okay, Colombia controlled Panama. And I think the French had tried to build the Panama Canal, but, they couldn't do it. And so for the U.S., building the Panama Canal, not just building it, but having access to it, would be like a step in the right direction for, again, becoming a world power. With the Panama Canal, the U.S. Teddy Roosevelt tried to, get the Colombians to give them access to it and like let the U.S. build it, but Colombia said no. Basically, they have no interest in helping the United States at all. So, this is where the big stick comes in, right? And again, what is he referring to when he talks about the big stick? Right? Because the phrase that he would use was speak softly, but carry a big stick. And what that means is be diplomatic. Try to come to some kind of an agreement. But if you can't, then don't be afraid to use a big stick and hit them over the head. And what he's talking about here is what? Military, right? If you cannot get what you want diplomatically, then use the military if you have to, right? And the bigger the military, the more powerful you are. And that's what the big stick is about. When he talks about the big stick, which is where all the phallus symbols come from, then he's talking about the military, right? The bigger the stick, the bigger the military, the bigger, the more power that country's going to have. So let's get back to Colombia before I lose it. Colombia is, they don't want to help out the U.S., right? The U.S. is making all these proposals. Let us build the Panama Canal, but they don't want to. They don't want to let us. So Teddy Roosevelt is then going to turn around and make a proposition to Panama. Like, hey, we heard Panama doesn't really let you do anything. How would you like to get your independence? Panama's like, let's see, let's do it. So, so the U.S. gets involved, and Colombia can't believe it. They're like, "Hey, what are you doing? Like how? Why are you metiches, right?" But essentially, what happens here, the U.S. uses its military power to get what it wants, right? Even if it means that Panama becomes independent from Colombia, it doesn't matter, because what the U.S. wants is to build the Panama Canal, because where's my map? Oh my gosh, let me bring it. Come on. I have to keep remembering to put it close by, right? What was it that Alfred Thayer Mahan said about the United States? It is perfectly positioned, right? It's got access to the New World and the Old World. It touches the Atlantic. It touches the Pacific. But it's in this very unique position. However, in order for a ship coming out of California, wanting to go towards Europe, it's got to go where? It's got to go all the way around. And that takes forever. And vice versa. If you're coming in from the East Coast and you want to go that way, right? It takes forever, literally months. Where is Panama located? Panama's located right here, right? In the isthmus, which is like a little shortcut area right there. If there was a canal built there, this would be great for the United States, because then it would literally cut the travel time in half, right? You take that shortcut and you go this way and you go that way. And it would make things a lot easier for the United States. It would be perfect, We've got the industry, we've got the workers, we've got the factories, we've got the technology, we've got the industrialization, we've got the Navy, we've got the power. All we need is a shortcut. Which is why the U.S. is very, very driven to make this happen. Which is why it's justified that they help Panama get their independence, because otherwise Colombia won't let them have it. If you look at the little notes that I have here, the Panama Canal is completed in 1914, opened for the first time in 1914, which is basically just in time for what? What are we going to talk about next? World War I. So, was it a good deal? Bad deal? Well, again, it all depends on how you see the purpose of what the U.S. is trying to achieve, the ways that they go about it, and, did they achieve what they set out to do? And in this case, the Panama Canal is a means to an end. And when you look at, White Man's Burden, the frontier thesis, and, wanting to be able to compete with these other countries, to the U.S. it's totally justified, right? But it's interesting the way that it all happens here, right? Just in time for World War I, right? Let's move on to the next president. Teddy Roosevelt decides not to run for a third time, okay, in 1908. And he chooses Taft as his predecessor, okay? Now, William Howard Taft and him were really, really good friends. Taft, is somebody that Roosevelt basically, prepared, and he handpicked him to replace him with the Republican Party to be the next president of the United States. But Taft is going to do things a little bit differently, okay? With Roosevelt, it was all about the big stick, right? Very aggressive, militaristic, version of isolationism and empire building. But with Taft, his policy, his foreign policy, is known as dollar diplomacy. Okay? Taft is somebody that, he was a better ex-president than a president. He, little backstory to him, he himself didn't really want to be president. That wasn't his dream. What he really wanted to do was to serve on the Supreme Court, right? He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, which he did. And he was pretty good at it later on. Like I said, he was a better ex-president than president, kind of like Jimmy Carter, okay? But, he is somebody that has a little bit of trouble, with diplomacy and things like that. But his approach to all of this is, to take the U.S. in a different direction than Teddy Roosevelt did. His method in dealing with other countries and dealing with diplomacy is to foster this idea of, the almighty dollar, right? Which is why it's called dollar diplomacy. Now, the approach here is to encourage American businesses to set up shop in Latin America. And because the theory, the working theory here is that if the U.S. has financial interests in these countries and they're helping to create jobs and help those economies, then this is going to give them influence over those countries, okay? And so again, this is why it's called dollar diplomacy. It's about continuing our commercial access to China. It is about encouraging American businesses to set up shop in Latin America, using the almighty dollar, right? Helping their countries by creating jobs, by helping their economies. So whenever, this situation comes up, that the U.S. needs to be able to influence countries like Nicaragua or Guatemala, then we already have reasons for those countries to, help us out, should the need arise. And, it's again, it's part of the reason why American involvement is, so heavy in Latin America, because in part, remember, we're trying to establish that this is like our realm of influence. This is our, part of the Western Hemisphere. But it's not going to be as aggressive like as Teddy Roosevelt and the big stick policy, right? Teddy Roosevelt is more like, okay, let's try to come to an agreement, but if not, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, which usually means, it's a military threat, it's violence. And it's just, it's kind of ironic, this whole thing, because this whole period is all about preserving isolationism, right? We're launching this quest for an empire, but we're still desperately trying to remain isolationist. Now, it didn't seem irrational at the time to say that we're isolationists and still be involved in like Latin America and in the Pacific, because remember how it's being justified. There are little brown brothers and it's a white man's burden. Our isolationism is directed towards Europe. We don't see them as our little brown brothers, right? Or as lesser than us. They are our political and economic competition, military competition. So we are trying to stay away from any conflict going on in Europe. But we also don't want them interfering over here, which is what Teddy Roosevelt was trying to, preserve, right, with his Roosevelt Corollary. Now, by the time the Panama Canal is ready, the U.S. has built up its military. It's poised, right? It is ready to take it to the next step. But in 1914, war breaks out in Europe. And the U.S. is going to try super hard to stay out of that. We're going to try to stay isolationist. We do not want to get involved in the Great War. And ultimately, our neutrality, right? Because Wilson's basically going to say, we're going to stay out of it. We're neutral. We're not going to be involved. But our form of neutrality is what gets us into trouble, right? Because part of the deal here is that the United States, while isolationist, while staying out of Europe, is going to supply these countries going to war with one another with weapons. And that form of neutrality cannot be maintained forever, okay? So I hope you will join me for the next lecture. I can't wait to talk about World War One. I love it. It's my highlight of the semester. Um, and that's it. Okay, so make sure you are catching up with your book. Watch the little short videos for the discussion on the Great War. I think you're going to enjoy it. And then I'll meet you back here for the next one, okay? So that is it for now. Have a great day and stay safe. See you later. Bye.